We have had a great conversation over the last half hour about what it looks like to have boundaryless collaboration, where we're working more to develop strong relationships with our partners rather than just follow the transactions that we flesh out with them. I guess the one piece that we didn't get to is this idea that I have that if building back better is building back boundaryless. And Jenny, I won't put you on the spot again because you've been so gracious and talked so much already. But if anybody else has any thoughts on this, should it be rebranded? Should I call up President Biden and tell him he should be saying build back boundaryless? Or can we build back boundaryless, or does it just make things too messy? I just curious as to whether anybody has any thoughts on that. And Rebecca, I don't know if, again, you're just popping in, so I don't know if you have any particular thoughts about how collaborations with partners illustrate this idea of being boundaryless. In other words, not hampered by the traditional bounds that we put around organizations and roles, but also looking for the places where overlap happens and really thinking through. And Rebecca, as the president of the University Economic Development Association, I know you're very familiar with the main kind of boundarylessness that I'm talking about, which are boundarylessness between talent, innovation, and place. Curious if you want to weigh in, Rebecca, whether you see any of that. And then Anna, I just saw that maybe you were ready to chime in again. Maybe you're done chewing on that lunch. Did you want to say something more?
I guess, Jim.
Oh, here's Rebecca. Okay,
Hey,
great.
Jim. Thanks for popping me on. I just saw the notification and thought I'd pop on. Sorry, I'm running late, of course, in between things today. But I think everything that we do, both here at Kansas State University as well as in our efforts at the University Economic Development Association, are heavily focused on that. I call it boundary spanning. So it's right. It's an intentional effort to cut across boundaries. And yeah, I would say that much of the work that we do and that we see our role in as removing boundaries, whether that is between the university and the community, the university and companies, the private sector, whether it's talent, innovation, and place, and thinking pretty broadly about who our partners in that work should be. I think that is well aligned with where we're headed and where we should be headed.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I guess just a quick follow-up would be for me. So yeah, you clearly you get the boundaryless mindset, and you all are working towards that mindset in getting people to span boundaries, think across them. But when it gets down to brass tacks and you're developing a partnership or multi-partner partnership or collaboration, one of the things that we've talked a bit about today, and by the way, everybody, this is being recorded. I hope you noticed that when you logged in and saw the little recording button. If anybody has a problem with me using the recording, you should let me know. Just send me a note and let me know. But Rebecca, I was curious as to whether or not you have examples of what are some of the issues that come up that have to be worked through if we are really going to remove those boundaries. I mean, it's easy to say, but earlier in the conversation, Rebecca, before you joined us, we talked a little bit about why we have boundaries in place. They play a role. They help us understand who's doing what. They help us give people the opportunity to leverage their expertise and go deep on things. So removing the boundaries totally is not necessarily the goal. It's really more about not letting the boundaries get in way of opportunities to advance things. But, philosophically, to talk about being that way is one thing, but then to actually develop the partnerships. And Jenny shared a little bit about some of the challenges they face in developing partnerships. Are you willing to, obviously without naming names or organizations, talk a little bit about how has K-State faced challenges in trying to be boundary?
And I would say in some respects that, at least locally, we have been leaders in trying to reduce boundaries, particularly around whether it's economic development, in creating a university community partnership that was formalized and not just like a handshake and a press release, but actually created a new entity that both university and community co-fund and co-staff. And in our community, that organization is called Knowledge-Based Economic Development. And I've been staffing the last 13, 14 years. And in that effort was not necessarily to take away the roles of individual partners, whether that's the city, the chamber, the university, the different university family members, but it was partially because of scarcity of resources. Understanding having boundaries in place meant there was duplication of efforts. Everyone saw economic development as their role, but in partnering to combine resources, share resources, whether that's staff or financial resources, in order to be able to develop then programs and partnerships to drive economic prosperity. Those When I'm talking then to an industry partner, a prospect, or a company locally, it's not necessarily that I'm just representing the university. I'm also representing the community. And so in redefining where boundaries are or don't exist, we've been able to accomplish a lot more and have much stronger local partnerships.
That what a great kind of description, I think, of Boundaryless and what it looks like in practice, because it's not. I think everything that you just described, it's very clear that there are still boundaries, and they need to be there, and that people have their different roles in this kind of broad ecosystem, but that you're also making commitments. And I'd love to learn more at some point about the partnership that you talked about. I think it was a community partnership that was established, because I think Anna asked a question earlier about how we can get beyond this being a zero sum game. And some of it just has to do with sitting down with our partners or with potentially new partners and saying, look, we're going to do more. We're going to be able to do more together with the same pot of money than we would be able to do if anyone had that pot of money all by themselves. I know that doesn't necessarily entice people, because the bigger the pot of money, it sounds like for the organization, it's more resources. But I think if we can start to think about it, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts kind of thinking, I think that can become very powerful. And the zero sum game thing that you talked about earlier, Anna, I think becomes less of an issue. Not certainly that doesn't go away. Rebecca, if I could pick on you for just one more second I'm curious to know more about this partnership. And one of the things I talk about in the blog post that I've been referencing today, and if you didn't see the blog post in my earlier social media posts and you weren't here earlier, just go to my bio on Twitter, and there's a Linktree link, and you can go to that Linktree link. You'll see a link to Boundaryless, and that's the blog post that I'm talking about. But one of the things I talk about in that, Rebecca, and I know you've heard me talk about this before because of all of our interactions with UITA and APLU, is that I feel like there still exists this really, I should say it exists in many places, and then all of a sudden I find places where it doesn't exist, but there's a divide between the notions of economic development and community development. And I think that's because there's a big misunderstanding about what economic development is, or at least, and probably that misunderstanding exists for reasons. In other words, there's been a lot of economic development, that there's been a lot of stuff that's been done in the name of economic development that is all about kind of wealth creation for a few, rather than thinking about community economic prosperity. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that line gets blurred, or whether there are boundaries being blurred between sort of community development and what we would think of as community development and what people might think of as economic development, how that plays out, maybe even as part of this sort of official partnership or commitment that your community's made.
That's a great question, Jim, and one I that is certainly something that we talk about a lot here, in terms of what does the quality of life look like in our community? How are we developing the community in ways that are going to drive economic prosperity? And particularly here, I don't know that it's not that it doesn't exist everywhere, but Kansas State University is in Manhattan, Kansas. We're a 60,000 population community, and for the most part, most would consider us pretty rural. And so as we're thinking about driving economic development and collaborations within our community, it's also the same players because of the community and the understanding that all of these things are linked. And you can't, if you're going to say attract a company to the community, who comes with that company? It's people. It's And so how do you ensure that your community is a place that people want to work, live, and play in? And so thinking about being able to attract talent and have a workforce that drives economic prosperity is central to a lot of the efforts that we do. So it's not just, say, corporate partnerships or company attraction or expansion or entrepreneurship that we're thinking about. It's also, what do we need to do to make our community a better place?
Yeah, it's great. That thinking is kind of part of what you are. And I wonder if in smaller communities it's just natural to be thinking that about economic and community development as being more closely related. But the phrase that you used in there about the workforce that drives economic prosperity, I think what we've experienced over the last number of years is that we also have a lot of places where the workforce doesn't, they feel like they're driving economic prosperity, but they're not getting any of the economic prosperity. And to me, this is exactly why we have to stop talking about economic development and community development as different things. To me, they're pieces of the same tapestry that we've got to think about these things together, because when we don't, not everybody benefits, and we need more people to be able to benefit from it. Rebecca, I really appreciate you. Jenny was I got to pick on her for the first 20 minute half hour, and then you chimed in or popped in, and then you were very kind enough to let me call on you. I think we've had a great conversation. It looks like it might be time to wrap up because we've lost a few of our participants. But again, thanks so much for joining us. Oh, Jeff has come back and he is turned on his microphone. So I'm wondering if Jeff wants to chime in with something before we wrap up.
Jim, it only took me 45 minutes to figure out how to turn on my mic. I am not kidding, because I was trying to run through the desktop application and there were no instructions on that, so that you can report that back to Twitter.
And thank you for saying it, because it'll make me mindful next time to know how to explain things to people. So Jeff, I'm glad you figured it out though, and I would love to hear what's on your mind. But be sure to introduce yourself too.
Jeff Brancato. I've known Jim for a long time, and I'm less in the innovation and economic development space than I was years ago. So the image that I have in my head is that where many of you are in the roles and the organizations that are at the hub of these kinds of partnerships, I'm now more generally in an organization that's out at one of the spokes in terms of collaborating, particularly with university partners. Just the one quick thing that I'll say, Jim, before we close down, is that one of the things that this discussion brings to mind for me is that we need to think about both the boundaries that exist within institutions and the boundaries that exist within the broader community of partnerships. And your comment about boundaries are important because they provide structure is true in both. So it's a matter of thinking about, if you're in a university, the VP for Research office has certain kinds of roles and responsibilities and functions that it's primarily responsible for, and that contributes to the whole set of things that we're trying to do with respect to university-based economic development. But the continuing education office similarly has roles and responsibilities that contribute to our objectives. And then within the broader community, it's understanding, that community colleges add value in certain kinds of ways, and research universities add value in other ways. And specifically, public and private research universities add value in different kinds of ways, particularly with respect to where their students come from and where they generally go after they graduate.
Yeah. All excellent points, Jeff. And I think all of them, like many of them, spin out into new conversations, but I will just respond to the very first thing you said, that there are boundaries within our organizations and institutions as well as between them, and we have to tend to those too. Folks might remember when I was at APLU, I used to walk around saying, be the ecosystem all the time. And what I was trying to say is, how can we as a university, how can you as a university and your colleagues be effective players in the regional ecosystem if you're not behaving as an ecosystem, if you're not recognizing that you are yourself an ecosystem and allowing the sort of ecosystem dynamics to happen within the institution? And I absolutely agree with you 100%, Jeff, that closing some of those or well, closing the gaps or crossing the boundaries or whatever phrase you want to use within the institution is critical in most cases to addressing some of these bigger issues. And it's critical in really becoming part of sub ecosystems of talent, innovation, and place. I think you gave a great example with the continuing ed. Most people that I worked with at universities would just scoff at continuing ed, or at least they'd wonder even what it is. I don't even understand what they do. Not knowing what the full kind of complement of offerings that the institution has in education that can support the talent development in the region, I think that's a big mistake. So, Jeff, I really appreciate your thoughts. And
can I
Anna,
chime in a little bit here, Jim?
Yes, please do.
Okay, I'm finally in a stable internet spot. So,
okay.
So thank you. What a great conversation today, Jim, and thank you for convening it. You're such a thought leader for so many years in this area. Something that a thread, and I'd mentioned earlier, my background, I work in government relations. Something that keeps coming to my mind is these partnerships crossing boundaries, they have to be funded. And oftentimes we look, as Jenny talked about, we look to the federal government to be the funder of convening these types of partnerships or seeding new partnerships that cross these boundaries. And a challenge that I've seen in the seven plus years I've been doing government relations work for Northern Illinois University is that oftentimes the partners will come together, private sector, local government, local economic development authorities, et cetera, and universities. They'll come together and they'll talk about how investing in the partnerships and having federal investments in building out the ecosystem are really important. But when each of the partners goes and does their own meetings and their own advocacy with federal stakeholders, this partnership model is not in the top 3 or the top 5 priorities. And it's a tough thing to balance. And it's one of those things that at the end of the day, when it comes to our federal funders, they don't, as I said earlier about this zero-sum game where they have a limited pot of money. And so if they can make more people happy by being able to address their number 1 or number 2 priorities as an organization, they're more inclined to do something like that rather than they all have the same priority, but it's number 4 through 8 on their priority list of these different organizations. So I will say, though, I am encouraged because Congress, for the first time in 10 years, has revitalized what they're calling in the House the Community Project Fund Initiative, which is formerly known as earmarks.
Earmarks, right.
And in the Senate, it's called Congressionally Directed Spending, again, formerly earmarks. And something that I think is so smart in both, but especially that's a special focus in the House, is having letters of support for your, I'll call it an earmark for the shorthand, but pretend if I'm talking about the House, I'm saying community project funding, and if I'm talking about the Senate, I'm saying congressionally directed spending. But in short, for a House earmark request, you must provide evidence of community support for the project that you're proposing. And so that's a letter. So at NIU, we were submitting letters from, depending upon the project, we had letters from local police stations and fire offices. We had local elected officials. We had local nonprofits. We had other K through 12 school districts. We had the head of our economic development board. I mean, it really was a wide-ranging set of partners that we were able to convene around this. And I'll say in the Senate, we were successful in securing one of the largest congressionally directed spending allocations from the Small Business Administration. And that, Jim, is a project being led by our very good friend, Rena. And that is around economic development and in the food entrepreneurship and sustainability space. But that was a project that it had been in the works, or a part of it had been in the works for a while, but having the possibility of getting this injection, and I think if the funding is approved, we have to finish fiscal year 2022 appropriations for these projects to get fully funded, but it would be a $500,000 infusion into this community economic development and food and sustainability project. So I wanted to make folks on the call aware that is a possibility out there if you work with your government relations offices with that. But I think that it's really a good sign for what you're saying, Jim, with building back in a boundaryless way, because it's requiring that you show this broad base of support and engagement to even get in the door to start the conversation with a congressional office about getting this kind of funding.
Yeah, that is, I think, and when I was talking earlier about our policy structures need to change, that's exactly the kind of thing I was talking about, is that the policy has to say that you can't do this alone. You've got to do it with others, and that will start to drive the incentive. I think it will frustrate some, but I'm watching a state level program in Indiana just to see what kinds of programs come out of it. It's called READI, READI. I don't remember what that all stands for. I'm sure economic development is the ED part. I guess it's EAD. So I don't know what it stands for, but I'm watching that program because that is exactly what they did, is said, not only do you have to have the letters of support, you have to apply as a collaboration. And I think more and more of that kind of policy, I think, is super important. And just to quickly respond to one thing that you said early, Anna, and then I think we really will wrap up, but you said this idea that we walk into the congressional offices and we have our ask list, and the kinds of things that we're doing in partnership with others aren't even 1, 2, or 3 on that list of asks. They will go up, though, to 1, 2, or 3 if we walk into the door of our congressional offices with those partners. And I remember when I was at APLU, we did this a lot to try to encourage our university folks to hook up with an industry partner and go visit their congressional delegation with that industry partner or with other partners, just because I think it changes, then it helps to push the boundaryless mindset among those policymakers when they actually see people coming in the door together. And as you point out, they're going to hear a different set of priorities when the partners come in together. So thank you so much, Anna, for those comments. Jeff, I really appreciate your chiming in. And of course, Jenny, letting me make you a panelist here, basically answering all those great questions about your partnership. I'm also grateful to Rebecca for being here for a little bit and chiming in. And I also appreciate the other people who dropped in, Paul Garton and Nick Wigington. And this is recorded, like I mentioned. I'm going to put a replay out online. I couldn't have asked for a better first experience with Twitter Spaces. So I'm so grateful to all of you for joining this conversation. And I'll be sure to let you all know when the next one is happening for sure. But maybe we can get some other people to show up, and then I won't have to pick on all of the same people. But not that that would be a bad thing, because you all contributed so well and with lots of great ideas. So thanks.